The South Korean film Parasite made a clean sweep at the 2020 Oscars. For the first time in history, a non-English language film won the main award, the Oscar for Best Film, in addition to 3 other awards. So, if this were not VisualPolitik, we might be mistaken for believing that South Korea is at the top of their game lately. However, you know that here on VisualPolitik, we like to go a little bit deeper. And the truth is that the South Korean economy is going through a bit of a rough patch, both now and even before the coronavirus pandemic. In a past video, we told you how the South Korean model seems to be exhausted. In today's video, we're going to talk about another one of the big issues that have all the economists in the country on edge. You see, my friends, South Korea, and especially Seoul and its metropolitan area, have a serious problem with their real estate market. A problem that has been brewing for years. We are talking about one of the hottest, most frenetic real estate markets in the world at the moment. And take note, because I'm not just referring to the hundreds and hundreds of cranes that have been erecting new buildings all over the city for years. I'm also talking about the prices. Over the past 5 years alone, housing prices in Seoul have shot up by more than 20%, and that's on top of levels that were not exactly low to begin with. Quite the contrary. Meanwhile, over the same period, cumulative inflation has been around about 6%. In other words, house prices, which were already very high, have risen well above other prices. And that's when the problems start, especially if we're talking about an economy that seems exhausted. As you can imagine, this has made it very, very difficult for families and young people, especially young people, to start an independent life. Prices are simply skyrocketing, and families need to get into astronomical debt just to get on the housing ladder.
Household debt grows much faster than income. The Korea Times.
Well, the fact is that in the face of such a scenario, current President Moon Jae-in has decided to make this problem one of his political priorities. During the election campaign that brought him to power, he promised to take all necessary measures to deflate the prices of the real estate sector and make housing affordable for young South Koreans. Now, does this ring any bells for anyone? I'm sure it does. It's a strategy that's trending with politicians all around the world. However, my friends, 3 years after coming to power, things in South Korea are worse than ever. And yet, as we shall see, this president has not been procrastinating. So, what exactly are these measures? How has Moon Jae-in attempted to make housing affordable? Are these measures working? What can we learn from the changes he's made? And how could this matter impact the battered South Korean economy? Want to find out? Let's get cracking.
The most inaccessible Seoul.
The data is devastating. You see, I don't want to bombard you with figures, but there are a few that are key to understanding the scale of the problem here. For example, 4 years ago, buying a home in Seoul cost roughly 8.8 years of the average full salary. When Moon became president in May 2017, that figure had already risen to 11 years. And at the current time, the estimate is more than 14 years. Of course, we're talking about a relatively small, non-luxury homes. That is, an average apartment of about 60 meters squared in a regular neighborhood can cost almost $500,000. In other words, the Seoul real estate market is almost as hot as the London market. The difficulty in accessing housing in this city today exceeds that of cities like Paris, Singapore, or New York. That is not all. Added to this situation, we have the slowdown of the South Korean economy and the increasing deterioration in employment figures, something that has only been further accentuated by the coronavirus crisis. For example, unemployment among the youngest citizens, aged 15 to 29, is close to 10%, an abnormally high level for this Asian country. The once fierce Asian dragon has stopped roaring, and that has set off all the alarms. On the one hand, access to housing for young people is becoming almost a mission impossible. And on the other, doubts are beginning to grow as to whether or not the housing prices are sustainable. In other words, could Seoul be facing a bubble that is about to burst? And yeah, we think that's a good question. Because you see, my friends, Moon Jae-in promised to end the housing problems, but since he came to power, they've only been getting worse and worse. But hold on just one moment. The current situation in the real estate market is not Moon Jae-in's fault. It has been brewing for a long time. At least since the time of Conservative President Park Geun-hye, who was removed from office due to a huge corruption scandal, and now she sleeps behind bars. But what on earth did South Korean politicians do to cause housing prices in some areas of Seoul to rise faster than in cities like Hong Kong or Montreal? Well, let's take a look.
The same old root of the problem.
So, my VisualPolitikos, the problem with politics is that our representatives tends to worry about the short term, about the next election, and then not so much about what comes after that. Face it, if you're a politician, you have very little incentive to worry about what's going to happen in the medium and long term. That is why it is often the case that when they get their hands on institutions such as the central bank, things do not end well. And that is exactly what happened in South Korea. The combination of expansive monetary policies to encourage the granting of mortgages, along with the constant regulations of give and take in the country's property sector, largely explain everything that has happened. Mind you, I'm not the only one saying this. The former president, she's telling us this. Take a look at this.
I will drastically boost the property market and loosen up unnecessary regulations so that the economy can be revitalized. Many measures adopted to prevent property market overheating turned out to be obstacles after the market went down. These need to be loosened up a bit. Ex-President Park Geun-hye.
And boy oh boy, did it all get loose. The real estate market in Seoul is on its way to becoming the second most inaccessible market in the world after Hong Kong. And take note, because when the president spoke of relaxing regulations, she wasn't talking about rules that would limit the amount of construction or making projects more expensive. Not by a long shot. It was basically about doping the economy by lowering interest rates and boosting credit as if there was no tomorrow. For example, as you can see, there was a huge reduction in interest rates without any crisis to justify it. The essential objective of the government was, as the former president herself acknowledges, to feed the real estate sector with more and more credit. In this way, more jobs would be created, prices and salaries would go up, South Koreans would see their wealth grow and grow, interest rates would go down, and young people would have all the mortgages they needed to buy the houses they wanted. And so, everyone would be happy. And it went even further than that. Low rates encouraged savers to invest their money beyond typical bank deposits to get some return. And where do families invest their money in periods when house prices are rising? Exactly. They invest in more houses, which feeds the whole process even more. More demand, higher asset prices, more real estate development, more jobs, higher salaries, and let's keep this party going. Because everything sounds good, right? But then the problem, my friends, is that this is precisely how bubbles are formed, especially real estate bubbles. Then there comes a point when prices are so high and families are so in debt that this whole process stalls. And then suddenly, the bubble bursts. Until that bubble bursts, the final years of this whole race become especially hard for people who want to buy a house. The prices are so high and have increased so dramatically that the distance between house prices and salaries become astronomical, and the effort to pay the mortgage is almost titanic. Park Geun-hye knew exactly what she was doing, doping the South Korean economy to fulfill her short-term promise that the economy would grow by more than 3% a year. The problems would come later, but that would be someone else's problem. Who cares? And this brings us squarely to a key question. How can such a colossal mess be fixed? And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that it is a tough assignment. Let's take a look at Moon Jae-in's plan to prevent the bubble from bursting, all the while making homes more affordable. Does he have the magic formula? Well, let's check it out.
Fighting intervention with more intervention.
So my friends, slowing down this process once it picks up speed can be as complicated as trying to stop a runaway train. And yes, some of you might be thinking, well, let's just raise the interest rates and that's it, right? Well, No, it's not that simple, and it is certainly not the best strategy if you happen to be a politician who wants to keep your popularity rating up, or you're thinking about the re-election of your party. Raising interest rates or slowing down the granting of credit would simply mean that many people would not be able to pay their mortgage or get one in the first place. Not only that, as financing becomes more expensive, the demand for houses would fall. And this would also cause prices to fall, and many property developers would suddenly find their very existence in danger. And of course, all of this would affect more than just real estate companies. The higher cost of financing and the lower demand would lead many companies of all kinds to bankruptcy. Thousands of jobs would be lost. Suddenly, defaults and loan defaults would multiply like weeds. The banking system would start to wobble, etc., etc., etc. The outcome of all this should sound very familiar to you because it's what happened to us all in 2008. Most likely, the bubble will burst right in front of our faces. Once you open a Pandora's box, closing it is not so easy. Playing with the central bank can turn into your worst nightmare. However, South Korea is not yet quite in that situation. And the question we can ask ourselves is, so what does Moon Jae-in want to do to avoid the nightmare? Well, their plan was put into action on the 13th of September 2018. On that day, he presented a very ambitious package of measures that basically consisted of more regulation. In other words, trying to stop the price escalation by using the law. In this way, the government described a number of areas in the country as speculative areas, or, in other words, areas with high demand and lots of real estate transactions. In these areas, most of which are located in Seoul, numerous restrictions have been put in place. The most important of these are the prohibition of granting a mortgage to those who already own several homes, restricting mortgages for luxury homes that are not intended to be lived in, and the establishment of a limit of 40% of the property price to the financing that banks can grant to companies that buy houses and then rent them out. In this way, Moon Jae-in seeks to limit access to credit to certain agents, such as multiple owners. In other words, it wants to artificially reduce demand in order to curb the price increase. In addition to these measures, the government also announced a public housing program to increase the supply of real estate at pre-appraised prices. Listen up.
Government to supply 300,000 public homes through 2021. The government will complete the purchase of 4 or 5 idle sites in Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi province. It plans to build 4 to 5 new small residential towns between Seoul and the existing large residential areas of Ilsan and Bundang. The Korea Times.
But wait, because there's more. Recently, this housing program had been extended, and both the government and several public companies have made land available to build 132,000 new homes. At the same time, the maximum height of the apartment blocks has been increased from 35 to 50 floors. And not only that, but an urban rehabilitation program will be created to speed up the process of tearing down older, lower-rise apartment developments and building new, higher and more efficient ones. So, basically, it's a full-blown re-densification project. In the end, all these recent measures are setting Korea on a different path, increasing supply rather than focusing on artificially restricting demand. In fact, as you can see, despite the measures taken in that direction, prices have continued to rise at roughly the same rate as Moon's popularity as president has plummeted.
Moon's approval rating plummets as house prices keep soaring. Nikkei Asian Review.
And it's kind of no wonder. South Korea is facing a very complex scenario. On the one hand, its economic growth has slowed down a lot. In fact, in 2020, a slight recession is expected due to the coronavirus. On the other hand, the housing bubble has not been stopped, partly because the government has not only not reversed the expansive monetary policy, but has fed it even more in an attempt to curb the economic slowdown. In addition, Moon Jae-in's policies have undermined the country's long history of competitiveness. This is something we talk about in this video. And friends, we could be looking at a perfect storm. And keep in mind that this is not the first time this country has been in a similar situation. It also happened during the late 80s and the early 90s, something that, by the way, ended with the country being the worst hit by the Asian financial crisis of 1997. So at this point, the questions we are left with are as follows. How can South Korea escape from this situation? Is more regulation the key to curbing the real estate crisis? Could South Korea be on the verge of a large bubble bursting under the auspices of constant monetary interventions and removable regulations? There are many, many questions. As always, we at at VisualPolitik will be keeping an eye on what happens. But now, it's down to you. Do you think it's justified for governments to intervene in the market every time they feel that prices have risen too high? As always, we ask the questions and we let you provide the answers. Thanks for watching the video, and as always, I'll see you next time.